Beneath the gold-tinted skyscrapers and vast oil riches of Saudi Arabia lies a world rarely seen by outsiders. From secretive laws to chilling punishments, these are the truths hidden from tourists and kept out of the headlines. Welcome to 8 dark truths about Saudi Arabia they don't want you to know. Brutal public executions. Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries in the world that still conducts public executions, often by beheading. Crowds gather in designated squares, and sometimes the event is even announced in advance. The death penalty is applied not just for murder but also for drug offenses, apostasy, and sorcery. Current scale and trends. Saudi Arabia has experienced a dramatic surge in executions, with 2024 marking the highest execution toll in decades. Saudi Arabia's escalating use of the death penalty has reached horrifying levels in 2024, with at least 306 individuals executed as of 6 December, the highest known figure in Saudi history. Different monitoring organizations have slightly varying counts, with some tracking 345 people in 2024, up from 172 in 2023, which represents approximately one execution every 25 hours. This sharp increase has continued into 2025, with at least 88 people, including 52 for drug-related crimes, executed between January and April 2025 alone. The nature of public executions. Understanding the public aspect requires some historical context. Saudi Arabia has traditionally carried out executions in public spaces, particularly in what's known as Dira Square in Riyadh, sometimes called Chop Chop Square by critics. However, Saudi Arabia performed public executions until recently, but it is unclear if this practice continues, with some reports suggesting the practice may have been scaled back or moved to more private settings. What makes this situation particularly concerning to human rights observers is the expansion of capital punishment beyond traditional murder cases. In 2024, Saudi authorities have so far executed 53 individuals solely for drug-related offenses, after only 2 executions for drug-related offenses were recorded in the country in 2023. This represents a significant shift in application of the death penalty to non-violent crimes. The international community has expressed alarm about several aspects of this situation. More than 150 people were executed for non-lethal crimes this year, according to the tally, which rights groups say is contrary to international law. The use of capital punishment for drug offenses is particularly controversial under international human rights standards, which generally restrict the death penalty to most serious crimes involving intentional killing. Adding to the concerns is the lack of transparency in the judicial process. In the absence of transparency, and with executions sometimes carried out in secret, the real figures may be even higher. This opacity makes it difficult to assess whether due process protections are being followed, and whether defendants receive adequate legal representation. The executions have increasingly affected foreign nationals, with citizens from Egypt, Syria, Nigeria, and Jordan among those executed. This raises additional concerns about consular access, language barriers in legal proceedings, and whether foreign nationals receive adequate legal representation. Saudi Arabia defends its use of capital punishment as necessary for maintaining law and order and protecting national security. The kingdom argues that its judicial system follows Islamic law, and that these measures are essential for deterring serious crimes, particularly drug trafficking, which they view as a threat to society. This situation represents a complex intersection of legal systems, cultural practices, human rights concerns, and international law. The dramatic increase in executions, particularly for nonviolent crimes, has drawn significant international attention and criticism from human rights organizations worldwide. Understanding this issue requires considering multiple perspectives while acknowledging the serious human rights implications involved. The internet may be open globally, but in Saudi Arabia, it's heavily monitored. Websites critical of the monarchy, LGBTQ+ content, and independent news outlets are all blocked. Speaking against the government, online or offline, can lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Let me help you understand how censorship works by starting with the fundamental concept, and then exploring how it manifests in our interconnected world today. Think of censorship as a filtering system that controls what information can flow freely through society. Just as a water filter removes certain particles while letting others pass through, censorship removes certain ideas, images, or information while allowing others to reach the public. The key difference is that while water filters remove harmful substances, censorship often targets information based on political, social, or ideological criteria rather than objective harm. The digital age has transformed censorship from a relatively simple matter of controlling newspapers and radio broadcasts into a complex, multi-layered system that operates across countless platforms and jurisdictions. Governments worldwide intensified online censorship in 2024 and early 2025 through internet shutdowns, platform bans, legal takedown demands, and arrests for social media activity. This represents a fundamental shift in how information control operates in our modern world. To understand the scope of this phenomenon, consider that in 2024, more people live under regimes with substantial censorship of the internet and social media than ever before. This means that if you were to randomly select a person from anywhere in the world today, they would more likely than not live under some form of significant online censorship. Digital censorship operates through several interconnected mechanisms that work together to create comprehensive information control systems. The most dramatic of these is the complete internet shutdown, which has become increasingly common. It was a record year for internet shutdowns, 296 shutdowns across 54 countries in 2024, a sharp increase from previous years. Think of these shutdowns as temporarily turning off the electrical grid, but instead of cutting power, they cut information flow entirely. Beyond complete shutdowns, governments employ more subtle techniques. Website blocking creates digital walls around specific content, while social media regulations act like gatekeepers, determining which conversations can take place in public digital spaces. Internet freedom has been on the decline, with nations using techniques like website blockading, social media regulations, and big surveillance. Modern censorship has become more sophisticated through the integration of artificial intelligence and automated systems. Global internet freedom declined for a 13th consecutive year in 2023, partially as a result of AI being used to sow disinformation and enhance content censorship. This represents a qualitative change in how censorship operates, moving from human-reviewed content removal to algorithmic filtering that can process massive amounts of information instantaneously. Imagine trying to monitor every conversation in a city of millions of people. Human censors would find this impossible, but AI systems can scan, analyze, and flag content across entire digital ecosystems simultaneously. This technological enhancement allows for both more comprehensive censorship and more targeted control of specific types of information. The global landscape of internet freedom reveals stark disparities that help us understand how censorship varies across different political and social systems. Internet censorship varies globally. Canada is free, while China uses the Great Firewall. This comparison illustrates how different approaches to governance create entirely different information environments for citizens. Consider how your daily experience of information access depends entirely on your geographic location. A person in Canada can access virtually any website, join any online discussion, and share information freely. Meanwhile, someone in China encounters the Great Firewall, a sophisticated system that filters, blocks, and monitors internet traffic on a national scale. The effects of widespread censorship extend far beyond simple information blocking. These measures suppress dissent, restrict unfastened speech, and shape the information panorama for healthy political agendas. This creates what we might call information environments where different populations develop entirely different understandings of reality based on what information they can access. Think about how your worldview is shaped by the information you encounter daily. If that information is systematically filtered, your understanding of events, your knowledge of different perspectives, and even your ability to form independent judgments becomes constrained. This is perhaps the most profound impact of widespread censorship. It doesn't just hide specific pieces of information, but shapes how entire populations understand the world around them. The current state of global censorship represents what researchers describe as a perpetual struggle between control and freedom. where the delicate balance between these opposing forces shapes the digital world we inhabit. This tension manifests differently across various societies, creating a complex patchwork of information environments worldwide. Understanding this tension helps us appreciate why censorship debates are so contentious. Governments often argue that some level of information control is necessary for national security, social stability, or protecting citizens from harmful content. Critics counter that such controls inevitably expand beyond their intended scope and become tools for suppressing legitimate dissent in democratic discourse. Despite recent reforms, women in Saudi Arabia still face severe restrictions. Guardianship laws require women to seek permission from male relatives for marriage, travel, and even some medical procedures. While driving is now allowed, true equality remains far off. The state of women's rights in 2024 and 2025 presents a complex paradox that helps us understand how social progress operates in our interconnected world. The basic rights of women and girls are facing unprecedented growing threats worldwide, from higher levels of discrimination to weaker legal protections, and less funding for programs and institutions which support and protect women. This represents a particularly troubling development because it suggests that progress in women's rights is not a linear path forward, but rather a contested terrain where gains can be reversed. To grasp the scope of this challenge, consider that even in 2024, poverty has a female face, indicating that fundamental economic inequalities persist despite decades of advocacy and legal reform. This phrase captures something essential about how gender intersects with other forms of disadvantage, creating compound barriers. Women's rights limitations operate through multiple interconnected systems that reinforce each other in complex ways. Let me walk you through how these systems work by examining some specific examples that illustrate broader patterns. Consider reproductive rights as a case study in how legal restrictions create cascading effects. In 2024, while abortion on demand is legal in 77 countries, it remains illegal or subject to restrictive conditions in 112 others. 753 million women of reproductive age live in countries with restrictive abortion legislation. This statistic reveals how legal frameworks directly shape women's autonomy over their own bodies and life choices. Think about what this means in practical terms. When a woman cannot make decisions about her own reproductive health, it affects her ability to plan her education, career, financial security, and family structure. These restrictions don't exist in isolation. They connect to broader questions about who has authority over women's bodies and choices. Understanding limited women's rights requires recognizing that restrictions exist on a spectrum, from subtle social pressures to severe legal prohibitions. This spectrum helps us understand how different societies create different environments for women's participation in public life. At one end, we see dramatic examples like the ongoing situation in Iran, where a women-led revolution took hold across the country, lasting several months and resulting in thousands of arrests, at least 500 deaths, and a brutal crackdown of women's rights activists following protests against mandatory hijab laws. This represents the most severe form of restriction, where governments use force to control women's appearance and behavior. At the other end of the spectrum, we find more subtle but equally impactful limitations. These might include workplace policies that make it difficult for women to advance to leadership positions, social expectations that place disproportionate caregiving responsibilities on women, or educational systems that channel women away from certain fields of study. One of the most challenging aspects of understanding women's rights limitations is recognizing that progress and regression can happen simultaneously in different parts of the world, or even within the same society. Women's representation in parliaments more than doubled, and countries continue to remove discriminatory laws, with 1,531 legal reforms between 1995 and 2024 in 189 countries and territories. This statistic demonstrates significant progress in formal political representation and legal equality. However, it exists alongside the concerning trend that 1 in 4 countries report backlash against women's rights in 2024, suggesting that legal progress doesn't automatically translate into social acceptance or practical equality. Think of this like a river flowing in 2 directions at once. In some areas, social currents are moving toward greater equality, while in others, they're flowing backward toward more restrictive approaches. Understanding this complexity helps us appreciate why women's rights advocacy requires sustained, multifaceted efforts rather than assuming that any single victory creates permanent change. The political dimension of women's rights limitations reveals how broader ideological conflicts shape individual women's experiences. From the United States to the Democratic Republic of Congo, women and girls' rights have suffered serious setbacks. This global pattern suggests that women's rights often become symbolic battlegrounds for larger political and cultural conflicts. Consider how political movements can use women's rights as a way to signal their broader vision for society. The highly conservative aims of Project 2025 are focused on a patriarchal future where abortion is banned and LGBTQ+ rights are denied. This example shows how women's rights become intertwined with broader political agendas that shape entire societies' approaches to gender, family, and individual autonomy. To truly understand limited women's rights, we must examine how economic factors both drive and result from gender-based restrictions. When women face barriers to education, employment, or business ownership, it creates economic vulnerabilities that can make them more dependent on others for survival and less able to advocate for their own rights. Think about how economic dependence can perpetuate other forms of limitation. If a woman cannot earn her own income due to legal restrictions on women's employment, she may be unable to leave an abusive relationship, pursue education, or make independent life choices. These economic barriers create a self-reinforcing cycle where limited rights lead to economic vulnerability, which in turn makes it harder to challenge those limitations. Understanding women's rights limitations also requires examining how cultural and religious frameworks are interpreted and applied. It's important to recognize that the same religious or cultural tradition can be interpreted in ways that either support or restrict women's rights depending on who holds interpretive authority and what their goals are. This complexity means that addressing women's rights limitations isn't simply a matter of choosing between tradition and modernity, but rather involves ongoing negotiations about how traditional values can be honored while ensuring that women have equal opportunities to participate fully in society. The international community's response to limited women's rights reflects both the progress that's been made and the challenges that remain. Address systemic barriers, dismantle patriarchy, transform entrenched inequities, and elevate the voices of marginalized women and girls, including young people, to ensure inclusivity and empowerment. This comprehensive approach recognizes that addressing women's rights limitations requires more than changing individual laws or policies. Millions of foreign workers come to Saudi Arabia chasing opportunity, but, many end up finding exploitation and abuse instead. Under the kafala system, employers actually control their workers' legal status, often confiscating passports and trapping people in unfair conditions with, honestly, no legal recourse at all. Think of migrant worker abuse as a complex ecosystem where multiple factors interact to create conditions ripe for exploitation. Like a river system where upstream decisions affect everything downstream, choices made at policy levels, in corporate boardrooms, and by recruitment agencies flow down to shape the daily reality that individual workers experience. Understanding this system means we need to look at how power imbalances, economic pressures, and legal frameworks all combine to create vulnerability. The current scope of migrant worker abuse really helps us understand just how pervasive this problem has become in our interconnected world. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center recorded 665 cases of alleged abuse of migrant workers between January 1, 2024 and December 31, 2024. That's nearly 2 cases of documented abuse every single day, and honestly, these are only the cases that came to light and were formally recorded by monitoring organizations. To put this in perspective, just consider that these documented cases represent only the tip of the iceberg. Most migrant worker abuse actually goes unreported because of fear of retaliation, language barriers, a lack of knowledge about rights, or concerns over immigration status. So, each documented case likely represents so many more that remain hidden from public view. Understanding migrant worker abuse requires us to examine how exploitation becomes embedded in economic systems, instead of seeing it as just isolated incidents. migrant workers are at risk of extreme abuse throughout the recruitment and employment cycle, facing illegal and extortionate fee charging that leaves them many thousands of pounds in debt, even before they arrive to find harsh working and living conditions that are totally at odds with what they expected. This really highlights the systematic nature of the problem. Notice how the abuse begins even before workers arrive at their destination, through predatory recruitment practices that create debt bondage. You can kind of think of this like a trap that's set before the worker even begins their journey. By the time they discover the harsh realities of their working conditions, they're already financially trapped and have limited options for escape. The recruitment debt creates what economists call a sunk cost situation. Workers have already invested significant money and effort to secure their positions, making them reluctant to abandon their situations even when conditions become abusive. This economic psychology is a crucial part of how exploitation becomes self-sustaining. The global distribution of migrant worker abuse reveals important patterns about how economic development, labor laws, and enforcement mechanisms interact to create different levels of vulnerability. Surprisingly, some of the most documented abuse occurs in countries with strong legal protections on paper, highlighting the gap between formal rights and practical enforcement. For instance, research shows that developed countries with high labor demand can become hotspots for exploitation despite having robust labor laws. This paradox occurs because high demand for certain types of work creates economic incentives for exploitative practices, while complex immigration systems can make workers reluctant to report abuse for fear of deportation. Modern migrant worker abuse is, deeply connected to how global supply chains operate, creating layers of responsibility that can obscure accountability. Between January 1st and June 18, 2024, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center recorded 324 allegations of human rights abuse against migrant workers globally, linked to 224 identifiable companies. This data reveals how corporate structures can facilitate abuse through complex subcontracting relationships. Think of supply chains like a river delta, where the main flow splits into countless smaller channels. Each division of responsibility creates opportunities for exploitation while making it harder to trace accountability back to the original source. Consider how this works in practice. A major brand contracts with a supplier who subcontracts to another company, who uses a recruitment agency, who employs workers through yet another intermediary. At each level, there's pressure to reduce costs, and workers at the bottom of this chain often bear the consequences through reduced wages, poor conditions, and limited legal protections. To truly understand migrant worker abuse, we must examine the human experiences behind the statistics. Workers reported being verbally abused and harassed by employers. Employers threatening to revoke their visas. Workers experiencing punitive treatment for not meeting excessive production targets, such as being denied work. A worker being repeatedly raped by her employer and not reporting to authorities due to fear. These examples illustrate how abuse operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical abuse, psychological manipulation, economic coercion, and sexual violence often occur together, creating a comprehensive system of control that makes it extremely difficult for workers to escape or seek help. The visa threat is particularly powerful because it weaponizes the worker's legal status. Think of this like holding someone's identity documents hostage. Without legal status, workers become invisible to protective systems and vulnerable to any demand their employers might. Homosexuality is punishable by death in Saudi Arabia. LGBTQ+ individuals live in secrecy, constantly fearing exposure, blackmail, or arrest. There are no pride parades, protections, or acceptance, only fear and silence. Understanding restricted LGBTQ+ rights is, honestly, a complex landscape of progress and regression. Let me help you understand restricted LGBTQ+ rights by starting with the fundamental concept and building toward the complex ways these restrictions manifest in our interconnected world. Think of LGBTQ+ rights like a patchwork quilt that's still being woven. Some sections are beautifully complete with full legal protections and social acceptance, while other areas have gaping holes where basic human dignity is denied. Understanding restricted LGBTQ+ rights requires us to examine not just where these holes exist, but why they persist and how they're created by the interaction of legal systems, cultural beliefs, political movements, and social attitudes. The global scale, a world divided. To understand how widespread these restrictions are, we need to grasp the striking reality that shapes millions of lives worldwide. 1/3 of the world, about 32%, continues to criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts. This statistic tells us something profound about our global society. In nearly 1 out of every 3 countries, the simple act of loving someone of the same gender can result in imprisonment, fines, or worse. Think about what this means in practical terms. If you were to spin a globe and randomly point to a country, there's about a 1 in 3 chance that LGBTQ+ people in that location face criminal prosecution for their basic identity. This isn't just about abstract legal codes, it's about real people who must hide fundamental aspects of themselves or risk severe consequences. This global division helps us understand that LGBTQ+ rights restrictions aren't random or isolated phenomena. They represent systematic approaches to controlling human sexuality and gender expression that persist across different cultures, religions, and political systems. The consistency of these restrictions across diverse societies suggests they serve similar functions in maintaining certain types of social order and power structures. The mechanics of legislative assault. Understanding how restrictions work requires examining the sophisticated legislative strategies being used to roll back LGBTQ+ rights. In the last few years, states have advanced a record number of bills that attack LGBTQ rights, especially transgender youth. This pattern reveals how restrictions often operate through what we might call legislative bombardment. The introduction of numerous bills designed to create a hostile environment, even when not all of them pass. Think of this legislative strategy like a military campaign with multiple fronts. Rather than attempting one major assault that might fail, opponents of LGBTQ+ rights introduce dozens of smaller bills targeting different aspects of LGBTQ+ life. Some focus on healthcare access, others on education, still others on public accommodations or parental rights. Even when many of these bills fail, the constant legislative pressure creates uncertainty, fear, and resource drain for LGBTQ+ communities and their allies. This approach is particularly effective because it forces LGBTQ+ advocates to fight defensive battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. Think about trying to defend a castle while under attack from all sides. Even if you successfully repel most attacks, the constant state of siege takes its toll and occasionally allows some attacks to succeed. The restriction of LGBTQ+ rights also operates through federal policy changes that can have sweeping effects across entire nations. President of the United States Donald Trump signs an executive order entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. It would require federal departments to recognize gender as a male-female binary only, determined by biological sex assigned at conception, replace all instances of gender with sex in materials, and cease all funding for programs supporting gender diversity. This example really illustrates how restrictions can be implemented through administrative action rather than legislative change. Think of federal policy like the operating system of a computer. When you change the operating system, it affects how all the programs on the computer function. Similarly, when federal agencies are directed to ignore or restrict LGBTQ+ identities, it creates cascading effects throughout government services, funding programs, and legal protections. The language used in such policies is particularly revealing. Terms like biological truth and gender ideology are carefully chosen to frame LGBTQ+ identities as artificial constructs rather than natural human variation. This linguistic strategy helps justify restrictions by suggesting they're simply returning to natural or traditional ways of understanding human identity. One of the most concerning aspects of current LGBTQ+ rights restrictions is the specific targeting of transgender youth, who represent some of the most vulnerable members of society. The focus on young people reveals how restrictions often operate through what we might call protection rhetoric, claiming to protect children while actually restricting their access to support, healthcare, and self-determination. Think about how this targeting works psychologically and socially. By focusing on children, opponents of LGBTQ+ rights tap into powerful parental instincts and societal desires to protect young people. However, the actual effect of these restrictions is often to isolate transgender youth from supportive resources and affirming care, potentially increasing their vulnerability to mental health crises and social rejection. While ordinary Saudis deal with high unemployment and limited freedoms, the royal family lives in unimaginable luxury. Private jets, palaces, billion-dollar art collections. Some say they preach morality in public, but live lavishly and indulgently in private. Saudi Arabia remains a land of mystery, wealth, and contradictions, but behind the dazzling image lies a reality many would rather keep hidden. What do you think? Should the world look deeper or stay silent? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more truth-telling videos from around the world.